Yo, what up, everybody? This is Nothing But Bangers, aka MBB, aka Bangers, aka I've got a fun video today for you. A little bit of a change up from the normal analytical meta prognosticator, tournament predictor. Now we're going to be diving into my thoughts on the potential of what may happen with the new set coming out in just under a couple of weeks now. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about what cards we may see based on previous history, and I'm going to give you a little bit of a preview of each card as we go through them. So relax, sit back, and get ready for some banger prognostication. So before we get started with the predictions, I do want to let you know that if you want to avoid spoilers for like when the new cards come out, maybe now is the time where you tune out. But I don't know anything. I just want to make that clear. I don't know anything. Nobody sent me any emails. I have signed no NDAs. I have no idea what's going to release. But this is just a fun video. And maybe, I don't know, maybe we come back and look at this and we say, hey man, we were spot on with some of those cards. And if you have predictions, I want to know your predictions on what we may see in the new expansion mini set. It should be out, I believe, December 16th. That is, I believe, the date that we were given. So again, very soon. But I want to start off by looking at the history of the Pokemon trading card game. And one of the first things that stood out to me is that there were 6 sets in the first generation series. Now, one of the things that I started to think about is, you know, they mentioned that both of these sets, like the main expansions, were sitting at around 200 cards, and in some cases, like way more than 200 cards, right? So when you do the math and you just kind of look at these, you start to realize that there are roughly 220 cards if you combine base, jungle, and fossil, which were the first 3 sets released. Then you see this mini set, right? It's not a full expansion, and it's not necessarily a bunch of new Pokemon, but it's like a mini set in Team Rocket where it's 83 cards. And a little flashback to memory lane. So let me take you back to when I was a wee little lad. I was maybe I was 9 years old. That's exactly when I was 9 years old. And I remember seeing some of the first cards from Team Rocket, and I was like, oh, those are fake, right? Like those are just fake cards. But they turned out, obviously, they were real. But one thing that I noticed is it's 83 cards, which, by the way, the new mini set is supposed to be somewhere around 70 cards, right? So like you start to think about that and you're like, interesting. Okay. And then when you also think about there's no energy cards, right? They're not releasing energy cards as a part of the set unless they add like 1 or 2. You know, that makes the set just a little bit smaller as well, right? So my first prediction that I'll throw out there, I think that this mini set could have something to do with Team Rocket. Now, I know a lot of people have kind of prognosticated that it could be, something with the Elite Four and those trainers and them getting supporters. But let me go out on a limb and let me throw out there, let's put a prediction number 1, Team Rocket cards. Now, the next thing that you'll notice is the Gym Heroes in the Gym Challenge set, which include cards like Blaine's Arcanine, they have like that's actually the set where they introduce like Misty and Erica and Giovanni and all that. But in those 2 sets, you notice if you combine them, that's about 264 cards, which if you've seen some of the information on the new expansion set, like the full set that's releasing at the end of January, it's rumored to be over 200 cards, almost 300 cards. So that really makes me think that the release schedule is base, jungle, and fossil were the first set that we got. And when you also think about the fact that base, jungle, and fossil, you had to have all of those sets to collect all 150 Pokemon because, again, Mew was like a movie card, right? So when you think about it, if Genetic Apex, the set that is currently the first set that was released without the mini set, if that was supposed to be the first 150 Pokemon, then you get Mew if you collect all 150. And then the mini set is that Team Rocket expansion, then it would make sense that the Gym Heroes and the Gym Challenge set would be what we may see at the end of January. Now, the other idea that it could be is it could be Gen 2, right? But Again, just looking at how they released the first generation series, I could definitely see this being the case. So those are my first predictions of the video. So write that down. We'll come back to this. We'll have like a flashback whenever we start to see the mini set. Because again, it should leak. Like we should see like data mines and see the cards uploaded unless they do a really good job of masking it. So I assume we'll get a little bit of a preview, and make sure you hit that bottom button. It's at the, it's towards the bottom of the screen, right? Where you can subscribe to my channel so that way you get notifications when I release new content. So let's get to some of the individual cards that we haven't seen yet, but we may see in the near future. So one of the first cards that I want to talk about is Pokemon Flute. Choose one basic Pokemon from your opponent's discard pile and put it onto his or her bench. So I look at this card as a little bit of a really interesting utility card. It could be a win condition when paired with Sabrina. If your opponent decides, hey, I'm only going to have this EX in play, I'm not going to play any other Pokemon. Well, Pokemon Flute could put a Pokemon on your opponent's bench and make your Sabrina live. So there could be some cool skill interactions with this. It could be a potential cool little item card. I don't think that they would make it a supporter. And then on the other side of it, maybe it could be a little bit of a disruption card, right? Maybe your opponent plays 2 bench Pokemon at the very beginning, or towards the beginning of the game, and then one hits the graveyard because you knock it out. Maybe you're able to clog their bench by playing Pokemon Flute and cut them off from evolving more Pokemon. I don't know, that's some weird interactions there, but that's an interesting card that we may see. Another card that we may see is something like a Super Potion. And if you remember, we already have a potion, right? It's pretty common in a lot of top meta decks, but Super Potion would also be a very interesting card because it's like a potion, but instead of healing 20 damage, it's going to heal 40 damage, but you also have to discard an energy. Now, these are all cards so far from the base first 3 sets, right? So all these cards are from the first 3 sets that I'm going to be talking about right now, and then I'll tell you when I'm switching to the, the rocket cards. So again, Super Potion could be really good, especially in decks that prioritize 1 energy attackers or very low cost energy attackers. And then it could also make decks that also play grass type Pokemon have even more healing in combination with Erica. Now, do they have room for a card like Super Potion? That's an interesting question, right? You may just cut Potion altogether and then just play Super Potion on its own. Another interesting card that we may see in item form could potentially be a card by the name of Revive. It says put 1 basic Pokemon card from your discard pile onto your bench and put damage counters equal to half of its HP, and you round down to the nearest 10. So this could be a way that, hey, maybe one of your key basic Pokemon got knocked out, but you're able to revive it back onto your bench, and then you're able to evolve it in the next turn. Another way to look at this card is it could be a pretty interesting card in decks like Pikachu EX, which again is everybody's favorite, right? Everybody loves seeing that mouse. Okay, maybe not everybody, but it could be interesting that, hey, maybe instead of having a Pokemon in your hand that you're able to play and max out your bench, maybe you're reviving the Pokemon that they just knocked out. Maybe it's a way for you to get your Pikachu EX back that they just knocked out as well. For a Pokemon that may have a 1 energy attack, maybe it's like a Zapdos EX that you're bringing back onto your bench, and then you're attaching an energy and potentially attacking with it that turn. So there's a lot of cool, interesting interactions that Revive could open up. But again, hey, maybe very niche, right? May not be something that a lot of people are really interested in, and ultimately may not even matter at all. Another interesting card that's very similar is Recycle, and this falls right in line with those coin flips that we basically know and some of us love/hate the Pokemon card game for. Recycle says flip a coin, if heads, put a card in your discard pile on top of your deck. So this could work in combination with cards like Professor's Research, or even cards like Meowth. Basically, if one of your cards that you needed was already used, or maybe it's an evolution Pokemon that you're really banking on getting back so that way you can evolve, well, maybe Recycle is how you're able to get that card back from your graveyard, your discard pile, right? So that's another interesting card. Again, it's very niche. I don't think that it would necessarily see a ton of play, but it could be another option for some decks that, maybe don't play a ton of different Pokemon. Maybe they are just really set on their strategy and they want to make sure that they get, the specific cards that they need, even after it's already been knocked out. Another key thing to think about too is if we ever get cards that discard, right? So if we ever have to discard a card, well, now you know that recycle might be a way for you to get that card back. Now, this is probably one of the more interesting cards that I know a lot of people that play evolution decks would love to see. And again, this is still coming from the first set, the base set, but this is Pokemon Trader. And Pokemon Trader says trade one of your basic Pokemon or evolution Pokemon in your hand for one basic or evolution card in your deck. So this could be a way that could basically power creep some of the evolution decks past some of the, maybe mid-tier Pokemon decks that we see right now in Pokemon Pocket. The scary thing about cards like this and cards like Rare Candy is it's going to make decks like Mewtwo and Gardevoir and decks like Charizard and Moltres or Charizard and Arcanine very strong and boost them, right? It's going to boost them because it's going to have another way for them to find their Gardevoir on curve. Or maybe it's a way that they find, their Charizard on curve. So cards like this are very tough to, really say that they're good for the game or that they help things. But again, some people would love to see this card because, again, they could be the reason why, something like a Greninja gets even more consistency. Maybe you really enjoy playing decks like Venusaur, Nidoking, Blastoise, Nidoqueen. This could be a way for you to go ahead and get those Stage 2 decks online faster. Another way to look at it is it could be a way to get those Stage 1 decks going online faster. This could also boost decks like Dragonite. So there's a lot of different options that this card could really provide for every person that's playing the game. But again, it is a little bit scary because it does make Moltres even more consistent turn 1, right? You can trade in one of your dead evolution cards, get a Moltres, all of a sudden X speed out of your active, get that Moltres that you just started or just, searched, and all of a sudden Moltres is your turn 1 play, right? So again, I don't know that cards like this are good for the game necessarily, but eventually you have to imagine we will see them. Now, we're getting into some interesting disruption cards here. Last is one of the most popular cards when you go back into the history of the game, because Last was a way that basically, disrupted your opponent and you from playing trainer cards. There's different ways that you used to be able to draw in this card game, in the paper card game. And basically you could combine cards like Last and then imagine Meowth, right? Except instead of drawing one card, you draw 3, you draw 5, you draw 7 cards. That was actually a real card, right? Cleffa. So Last is really interesting because it could provide another form of disruption outside of red card. But the thing is, it's going to disrupt both sides of the game, right? It's going to disrupt you because you're also shuffling your trainer cards back. So basically, Last says you and your opponent show each other your hands, then shuffle all the trainer cards from your hands into your decks. So I don't know that they would allow something like this because it's very powerful, and it also could be like really, really disruptive. And it could be considered a little bit toxic for a lot of players that maybe want to use cards like Koga, Lieutenant Surge. Obviously, this stops cards like Professor's Research. And so then it turns it into, okay, it's just Pokemon against Pokemon. And cards like Meowth may get better. Cards like Caterpie may be better because of cards like Last. So another interesting card. Who knows? Maybe we see it coming up in this mini set. Now, as we round out some of the last few cards from the base set, this is the classic quote-unquote Rare Candy. But before it was called Rare Candy, it was called Pokemon Breeder. So this allows you to put a Stage 2 evolution card on your hand matching on the matching basic Pokemon. You can only play this card when you would be able to evolve that Pokemon anyways. Now that last part may be confusing for some people, and there's actually been quite a few rule changes with this. So let's break this down for a second. Let's just say that it's turn 1 of the entire game, and you open up with a Squirtle. Well, because Pokemon Breeder says you can only play this card when you would be allowed to evolve that Pokemon, you actually were not able to evolve that Squirtle into a Blastoise. However, there have been rule changes, and they've gone back and forth, that have allowed first turn Pokemon Breeders. or first turn rare candies. And so they've actually gone back and forth with this rule. So we're not necessarily 100% sure if rare candy or Pokemon breeder would even come to pocket, because again, that would be a card that would kind of warp. It would change the game. It would be very warping to the meta. Maybe in a bad way, maybe in a good way. But we're not sure how this card would even operate on Pokemon Pocket. I mean, you very well could be staring down a turn 1 Pokemon breeder or turn 1 rare candy, and then your opponent could flip, 5 heads on Misty, and all of a sudden Blastoise is dealing 160 damage. So it could be very disruptive. And again, there's cards like Gengar that might just shut down all of your supporters, and that would be very annoying to play against. And typically, like, those kind of play styles are not necessarily encouraged. They usually try to avoid things like that in the Pokemon trading card game, but every now and then, cards like that will slip into the meta. Somebody will find a way to abuse them, and they'll be really, really good. But again, cards like Rare Candy and cards like Pokemon Breeder, I'm not necessarily sure that they're great for the game. I'm not necessarily sure if they're bad for the game. All I know is there would be some very powerful turn 1 plays if you were able to play it turn 1. One idea that has been floated out there, because there have been some changes to these item cards where they were made into supporters. Or maybe there could be stipulations where it only works on your active Pokemon. So there's a lot of different ways that this could be introduced to Pokemon Pocket and maybe not be so devastating to go up against. I don't know about you, but for me personally, I would not enjoy seeing turn 1 Gardevoirs and then Mewtwo hitting me for 150 damage, on like my opponent's, second or third turn, right? Like, that is not necessarily super fun. Especially like if they go second, right? They attach to Mewtwo and then they rare candy or Pokemon breeder their Waltz to a Gardevoir. Well, now that Mewtwo's at 2 energy, right? If it's in the active, then on, I have my turn, because it's the first turn when I'm able to attach an energy because I went first, right? So I have 1 energy on my Pokemon, and then by the 4th turn of the game, which would be their second turn, they're using Gardevoir's ability again and attaching from their hand or from their energy generation zone, and now their Mewtwo is hitting me for 150 damage. So the game is effectively over unless I did something equally broken. So not necessarily sure that that's good for the game. Now, another interesting item card, and this one's a little bit dicey. And the reason why this one's dicey is because this would basically power creep a very popular supporter, which would be Koga. So Scoop Up says choose one of your Pokemon in play, return its basic Pokemon card to your hand. Now, keep in mind, it's just the basic. All the other cards would be discarded, right? So, this could be where, hey, you only get the Charmander back from your Charizard. But here's the thing. All that damage was that, your opponent may have spent 2-3 turns piling up on that card. Now that damage is cleared and your opponent has to find another way to get a knockout. So this card is very good if it comes as is. If it was turned into a supporter, it would be very interesting as well. So I don't know. We'll see if we get a card like this. All I remember as a kid is when I opened Scoop Up out of my pack, I was very disappointed. All right. So I think this is about the last card of the base set, but this is Pokemon Center. And this card is very interesting because it says remove all damage counters from all your own Pokemon with damage counters on them, then discard all energy attached to those Pokemon. So it reminds me of Super Potion, but it's like on steroids. Specifically in decks that you only use 1 energy to attack. This deck or this card could provide some very interesting synergy with decks like that. So if you've watched my deck profile on Exeggutor and Beedrill, I would put this card in my deck immediately because it would be basically like a better version of Erica in some scenarios, right? It wouldn't take up my supporter for turn, and then I would still get a lot of heal. And here's the thing, it wouldn't just heal one of my Pokemon, it would heal all of them. So I don't know that Pokemon Center would be able to be, put into Pokemon Pocket, but if it came as this text is written, I would 100% be playing it in some of my decks that require only 1 energy to attack. So again, the first thing that kind of comes to mind is Beedrill. There's a Gengar that is base Gengar and it only takes 1 energy to attack. And then you get into cards like Kangaskhan. So there's a lot of different things that you could potentially do with a card like this. So this is getting into the fossil set. This is Mr. Fuji. It says choose one Pokemon on your bench, shuffle it, and any cards into your deck. So basically, if you had a Charizard with damage on it, you could Mr. Fuji it back to your deck, and then hey, maybe you have a Charmeleon, ready to go, and you play Professor's Research and you draw the Charizard. But Mr. Fuji could be a very interesting card, especially for clearing damage on some of your Pokemon, right? It's basically like, hey, I'm taking away all that progress, similar to kind of like what you would do with Scoop Up, but instead of like it going to my hand, all the cards minus the energy, right, would get shuffled back into my deck. So I don't know, could be an interesting card. I would probably play around with it. I would definitely be testing some games with Mr. Fuji. And then as we get to some of the other item cards, Full Hill says your active Pokemon is no longer asleep, confused, paralyzed, or poisoned. Now what's interesting is it says confused, right? Because this is going back to the original TCG, and we have yet to see confusion in the Pokemon Pocket game. So maybe we see confusion, and maybe cards like Full Hill would be played more often as we see more status effects. But some people are against Full Hill because they think that cards like Wheezing would be a lot weaker, and that would basically make those cards somewhat obsolete. Personally, I think Full Hill would be great. I think it's eventually going to happen anyways. And, if you're dedicating one of your 20 spots to a card like Full Hill, which might not even be good because maybe your opponent doesn't play status effects, then hey, you're just kind of taking a gamble. So, I don't know. Pretty interesting card. Let me know what you think, but let's keep going. So Switch is a card where instead of getting Switch, we got X Speed. But Switch basically just says, hey, switch one of your bench Pokemon with one of your active Pokemon. Now, I have a card later on this list that is very interesting and may actually be another card that they release instead of Switch. But generally speaking, Switch is played in a lot of decks in the TCG that have room for it just because it allows you to pivot very easily. So Switch would definitely be played, and I would definitely play it in some of my decks. Now, moving on to cards from Team Rocket. So again, flashing back to the beginning of the video, I mentioned that, hey, maybe the mini set that's coming out in less than 2 weeks is very focused on Team Rocket. And this is actually the card that I alluded to where I saw it and I thought it was fake. I remember seeing Goop Gas Attack and I was like, oh, this is fake. But this says all Pokemon powers stop working until the end of your opponent's next turn. Very interesting disruption card, right? It could stop cards like Wheezing, right? It could also stop cards like Gardevoir, and that's an interesting tech option, right? Like maybe you're trying to make your Mewtwo matchup better for whatever deck you're playing, I don't know, but maybe you say, hey, let me put in a couple Goop Gas Attacks into my deck and let me try to slow down Mewtwo from ramping. That could set it a turn back, right? And that could allow me to knock it out potentially sooner than I normally would be able to because they're not able to deal that 150 to me. So again, Goop Gas Attack, I would love to see this in the game personally, even though it wouldn't impact a ton of cards in the game. I think the cards that it would impact, it could be game changing. So definitely think that Goop Gas Attack should come to Pokemon Pocket. Another card is in a form of disruption. Team Rocket Sneak Attack says look at your opponent's hand. If he or she has any trainer cards, choose one of them. Your opponent shuffles that card into their deck. So instead of blindly using something like a red card on turn 1, being able to go turn 1 Rocket Sneak Attack and see your opponent's hand would be insane, potentially cutting them off from a card like Pokemon Research and also gaining knowledge of their hand. I think this card would be played in a lot of aggressive decks where basically they want to out-tempo you by using one, low energy attacks, or maybe they're just very aggressive stage 1 Pokemon, such as like a Sandslash, such as like a Marowak, and things like that. So I do think that this card would be played in a lot of decks, and I would also love to see it, even though it would be extremely, extremely toxic. The thing that you have to remember about cards like this is they're really good in the beginning of the game, and then sometimes towards the middle of the game and the end of the game, they're not as good. However, in something like Pokemon Pocket, being able to Team Rocket Sneak Attack your opponent's Sabrina or Giovanni before you make your move or figure out if you need a potion, man, that would be massive. I think this would be a very interesting card to see. So this is a very interesting trainer card as well that was from the Team Rocket set, and it's just called simply Sleep. Flip a coin. If heads, the defending Pokemon is now asleep. Now, instead of, something like a Hypno, right? Instead of something like a Jigglypuff, you can basically play this card alongside them, right? Give you the opportunity to put your opponent's Pokemon to sleep even more. So decks like Dragonite might really like cards like this, right? It also could feed off of decks that want to stall as they build up sweepers. So maybe even decks like Blastoise, right? Where they just want to stall you until they can fully evolve a Blastoise and then bring the Blastoise in and hopefully sweep for 3 prizes. I think Sleep would be a very interesting card. But again, I'm not sure that they're going to be willing to print something like this into the Pokemon Pocket game. All right, now we're getting to the Gym Challenge, and here's a card that a lot of people want to see, and it's called Master Ball. Look at the top 7 cards of the deck. You may choose a basic or evolution Pokemon from those cards, put it into your hand, shuffle the rest of your deck. Now, obviously in Pokemon Pocket, there's no way it could be seven cards, right? That would be way too many cards. You got to think, after you draw your hand for turn, your prizes, and then, your card, if you went second, right, you draw your card for turn. Like, dude, you've already thinned your deck down to 46 cards. So 7 cards out of 46, that's roughly like what, 1/6 of the deck that you're looking at. So, I mean, what would 1/6 of 20 cards be? Or how much would 1/6 of, 15 cards be? Probably be what, closer to like 2 or 3, right? So it probably would come in as look at the top 2 or look at the top 3 cards and choose, a basic or evolution. And so there's a chance that you brick with this card in Pokemon Pocket if they were to translate it to the game. Another thing to think about is this is going to make decks that are playing stage 2s and even stage 1s slightly more consistent, which could definitely change the game. I think that I would rather see this kind of card as opposed to a rare candy, even though they would both signify a significant power creep in Pokemon Pocket. Moving on to another card from the Gym Challenge set. So this says discard 2 energy cards from your hand in order to put 1 basic Pokemon from your discard pile onto your bench. I don't think that we would see something like this necessarily so soon, but it could be interesting if we don't get cards like Revive. And the other thing is we don't have energy cards in our hand. So, 2 cards, discarding 2 cards from your hand would be pretty steep, but who knows, maybe we could see a card like this, and this is better than Revive in the sense that the Pokemon will come back without damage counters, but it's going to cost you 2 cards. So I don't know that we would ever see a card like this in Pokemon Pocket. Now, this is the first gym that we're talking about, and this gym would be very interesting because we're kind of curious. Are we going to get gyms? Right now, the only thing that we see on the filters are tool cards. We don't see stadium cards just yet. So I think that we're more likely to see tool cards before we see stadiums. But some of the stadiums that were in the early sets were something like a Rocket's Minefield Gym, where whenever a player puts a basic Pokemon onto their bench, they flip a coin. If tails, you put a damage counter on that Pokemon. So very interesting. It's a very double-edged sword, right? But it could make some interesting math problems, right? Could be a way that, hey, I got, my opponent took 10 damage before they even were able to attach an energy. And because of that, I was able to use, Giovanni or get a knockout. So this could be a very interesting card if it was released in Pokemon Pocket. Now, this is a card that I think we may see. It's not necessarily like a Sabrina, but it kind of is. And it's not necessarily like a Switch, but it's kind of a fusion of both. If your opponent has any bench Pokemon, he or she chooses one of them and switches it with his or her active Pokemon. Then, if you have any bench Pokemon, you switch one of them with your active Pokemon. Now, this could be a very interesting card because your opponent has to choose first. I could see them changing that. I could see them modifying this. I could see them just skipping this card altogether. But Warp Point is a very good card and has always played a little bit of a role whenever it was in paper. So, very powerful card. However, I'm not sure that it could be played in something like Pokemon Pocket when you have cards like Sabrina, which are a supporter, right? I don't know that they would allow it, but even though we've had supporters in the trading card like paper game, Warp Point has also existed at the same time as cards that are like Sabrina. So there is possibility. I don't know. I wouldn't write it off yet. The last card that I'll talk about in terms of the gems and the items, and then I'm going to spend a little bit of time on a couple tool cards, is going to be the Rocket's Training Gem. Each player pays 1 colorless more to retreat his or her active Pokemon. Man, this card would be fascinating, right? It would basically say, hey, I know that Starmie EX usually has free retreat. Now it costs 1. It would boost cards that have 1 retreat cost to 2 retreat cost. I mean, the ripple effect of this kind of card would be huge in some matchups. So I don't know. I would love to see these couple of gems get introduced. But again, I do think that we're more likely to see Pokemon tool cards first based on what we see with the filters. So you may be asking, yo, MBB, what tool cards are there? What Pokemon tool cards are already out there, and what might we see? Well, let's talk about those next. So the first card that I want to talk about that could potentially be released as a tool card would be Goldberry. Now, if you have played Pokemon TCG back in this era, Goldberry was a very good card for when it was out. In between turns, if there are at least 4 damage counters on this Pokemon that you've attached Goldberry to, you remove 4 of them and discard the Goldberry. At the start of the turn, if there are at least 4 damage counters, you discard Goldberry and remove 4 damage counters. So basically, either at the end of your turn, at the beginning of your turn, right, in between turns, you can discard this Goldberry and it's going to heal 40. So really interesting tool, and it could throw off some damage, right? Could throw off some damage calculations, allow your Pokemon to live longer. Another very popular card from back in this era is Focus Band. Focus Band is a Pokemon tool that says if it's attached to the Pokemon that would be knocked out by your opponent's attack, keep in mind attack, so not status effects, you flip a coin. If heads, that Pokemon is not knocked out and its remaining HP becomes 10 instead. Then discard Focus Band. This would be an awesome Pokemon tool, and the first Pokemon tools that I hope we get are these 2. However, there's a couple more that you may be interested in. Balloonberry says that when this Pokemon retreats, instead of discarding the energy, discard Balloonberry. So it's kind of like a one-time use free retreat, but it's in the form of a Pokemon tool. Definitely would be used in some decks that play very heavy retreaters. EXP All is another interesting Pokemon tool card that says during your opponent's turn, if your active Pokemon would be knocked out by your opponent's attack, then you may take one of the basic energies attached to your active Pokemon and attach it to the Pokemon with EXP All. If you do, you discard EXP All. So this basically allows you to say, hey, my Pokemon that I have, 3 energy attached in the active, it may get knocked out, but I'll get to move one of those energy to the next Pokemon that I'm going to attack with. Really cool card. Definitely has some pretty cool synergies. The last Pokemon tool that I'll talk about is Counterattack Claws. During your opponent's turn, if the Pokemon Counterattack Claws is attached to is your active Pokemon, and it's damaged by an opponent's attack, even if it's knocked out, you flip a coin. If heads, put 2 damage counters on the defending Pokemon, then discard Counterattack Claws. It's kind of like what Poliwrath's ability does, except there's a coin flip, right? And the cool thing is, this could allow you to get a knockout that maybe you weren't anticipating, or maybe it puts your opponent right at the correct health where now you can knock it out on your turn. So I hope you enjoyed this little preview, just having some fun as some cards that we may see, just looking back at the history of the first few sets from the Pokemon trading card game. I hope you enjoy the content, and again, thank you for letting me be background noise, maybe a little entertainment, maybe just a little fun, and I want to know your predictions for what we may see in the mini set and potentially in the set at the end of January. Until next time, peace!